Thanks very much, Cheryl. I think so. And Anthony, I can see, is here also.
G'day.
Great. So thanks so much. My name is Jessica Strout, and I am the Executive Officer of the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee with the Victorian Parliament, quite the mouthful in title. Prior to joining the Victorian Parliament, I worked in the Senate in both the procedure and the committee offices. And it's so nice to see some familiar names in the participants of or attendees list today. But it is my pleasure to introduce you to Anthony Close, Victoria's Parliamentary Budget Officer. And please excuse me if I refer to him as the PBO, as he's colloquially referred to here, who will be presenting this session. Anthony is Victoria's inaugural Parliamentary Budget Officer, establishing the PBO office just prior to the 28 general election. A relatively new addition to Victoria's integrity framework. The PBO provides independent policy, costing and advice to members of Parliament on economic, fiscal and financial matters. Anthony was previously Queensland's Deputy Auditor General and acted as Auditor General. In these roles, he drove a modernisation agenda through innovations in external public sector audit approaches and data analytics. In earlier years, Anthony held leadership roles in professional services, working with government and large private sector clients on business transformation, strategy, and improving business operations. So without further ado, I will pass to you, Anthony, to speak to the group about the work of your office and what opportunities you see there are for improvements. And Anthony will speak for approximately 20 minutes, after which we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you, Jessica, and thank you also to the ASPG for the opportunity to present today. My first presentation with you, and I think it started being contemplated about November last year, so we finally got there, which is fantastic. Look, in keeping with the conference today, I'd like to present on my experience in establishing and operating the first subnational permanent parliamentary budget office in Australia, what our current mandate is and the functions that we perform. Then I'd like to shift into evolution and what better practice looks like for independent fiscal institutions such as ours, and then explore what those opportunities are to evolve the PBO in support of our legislated objectives. Now, I am a Teams user living in a Zoom world, so if I stuff up the share screen, my apologies, but I'll give it a crack. Rightio, can you see that screen okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Fantastic, excellent, rightio. I've passed the first hurdle. So I'd like to start with a little bit of international context. And as Jessica said, we were established in 2018. There is an increasing number of independent fiscal institutions that operate around the world. And that graph really shows the proliferation of PBOs and independent fiscal institutions. Now, that international growth has been driven by the EU establishing a requirement following the GFC that member states actually establish an independent fiscal institution. And so that's why you can see that large smattering of bubbles on the right-hand side. But the OECD and also the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, have increasingly been advocating the establishment of independent authorities as part of their good practice fiscal frameworks. So IFIs are considered among one of the most important innovations in the emerging architecture of public financial management. It's very exciting to be a part of that. So while the fiscal decisions are ultimately the responsibility of democratically elected officials, according to the OECD, a well-functioning IFI can support sustainable financial management and sound fiscal policy by promoting credible fiscal rules. So we call those fiscal objectives and targets in the Victorian context. helping jurisdictions address the natural bias towards spending and deficits that they see, promoting greater fiscal transparency and accountability, and raising the quality of public debate on fiscal policy. They come in all shapes and sizes. I don't think there's one that's the same as the other. And there's a couple of examples. The Congressional Budget Office, which is established in the USA, it actually independently costs each piece of legislation passing through Congress using over 250 staff. The Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK undertakes an independent budget process rather than the HM Treasury itself. So there's some fairly fundamental issues or differences in approaches. But central to each of these IFI's scope and mandate is the local need that they're established to resolve. So in the case of the US CBO, members of Congress wanted to better understand the financial implications of the legislation that they were debating prior to passing it, the impact on the public finances. For the UK OBR, its goal is to reduce the bias associated in the official economic and budgetary forecasts. And we all know that a portion of a percentage can have a fairly large effect across time. So whilst we're a relative newcomer, there's significant interest around the world in what we're doing because we're only the third jurisdiction to perform election policy costing services, and we're now only one of 5 in the world. So the Netherlands, which you can see on that chart, which was established in the 1940s, they were the first. The Australian PBO at the Commonwealth level was the second in the last decade. And since the establishment of the PBO in the Victorian PBO in 2018, Canada and Belgium have also had their first election costing services implemented as well through increased mandates. So I'd now like to focus on the Victorian PBO and why it was established. According to the Treasurer in 2017, the local need that we were established and implemented to solve was to improve open and democratic government by strengthening that public debate, by levelling the playing field in relation to financial expertise between government and the opposition, minor parties and MPs, by facilitating iterative policy development by parties and MPs, and by encouraging parties and MPs to release their independent policy costings earlier to therefore gain credibility with their electorates. And then finally, to also provide the community with credible, independent and timely information to help inform their voting decisions. So we were established with a number of outputs or products and services that we provide. We deliver policy costings, which is an assessment of the financial impact to the latest state budget of a policy proposal. We prepare advice, which has a very broad mandate around fiscal, economic or financial matters. We prepare in an election period pre-election reports, which is our estimate of the total financial impact of a group of policies against the state budget, requested by parliamentary leaders that they may either keep confidential or they may publicly release prior to a general election. And then when all the dust is settled on the election, we then prepare what's called a post-election report. And it's the only product that I prepare that doesn't require an MP or a parliamentary leader to request me to publicly release it. And it's a comparative analysis of the policies of a political party's publicly announced. So we monitor throughout the entire election period every statement made by every parliamentary leader, and we make a judgment around whether or not that's a policy statement, and then we cost it within 2 months of the general election. So you can imagine that's quite a feat. Our election costing period starts next week, so it should be very exciting to start for the second time, and it'll end the Thursday 5 p.m. before the general election for Victoria on the 26th of November. Oops. Sorry about that. So for me to deliver these services, I have the power to request information and documents from the public sector to perform my functions. Now, having completed that one full parliamentary cycle, Our parliamentary stakeholders and also review by our oversight committee, thanks Jessica, is described us as having embedded ourselves as both a valuable and relied on independent professional advisory service. So we're very, very happy with the outputs and strategic review that we've had to date. My observations around that, stepping back from a full parliamentary cycle now, is that the sophistication of MP policy development has just significantly increased as a result of access to the advice that we provide. It gives MPs a greater understanding of the policy options, the drivers of economic, fiscal and financial impacts. The iterative policy development that we provide for them confidentially. MPs may do up to 20 or 30 variations of a policy specification with us to allow an MP or a parliamentary leader to balance both policy and financial objectives. However, we have in that time been challenged by being timely in our responses to MPs. So to prepare my responses, I've made over 600 requests to date to the public sector since the PBO's inception. Over this time, on average, the Victorian public sector has responded in time in only 34% of cases. They've not responded to all of my questions that I ask in 10% of cases, and we assess the usefulness of their responses, which either allows us to progress our response or not, and we only get useful responses in about 60% of cases. So if you think of any business in terms of its supply, importance of supply, that's a real challenge for us, and we've had to look at alternate data strategies and a range of other options to be able to deliver to our clients in Parliament. So how does this impact our service to parliamentary stakeholders though? Well, in Victoria, the timing of the release of the Victorian Government's agenda for a parliamentary sitting is at best around 2.5 weeks. This means that members who are aware of our information supply issue generally do not seek our services to support parliamentary debate. And if you look back into that legislative objectives, informing policy development and public debate in parliamentary in the Parliament of Victoria and the community, that creates a real challenge to achieving that legislative objective. So as we move into the 22 general election period, continued poor performance by the public sector to PBO information requests could potentially have a seriously material impact on election outcomes. And so it's a strategic risk we're very actively managing right now. So where to from here? What are the opportunities to evolve the Victorian PBO to increase its value proposition in support of these legislated objectives over time? Now, for me, the answer lies in the legislation, particularly in the functions and mandate relevant to best practice or better practice. The answer also lies in greater engagement, I think, with the Victorian community. And then to borrow from the OECD again, the PBO's evolution should also be considered of other local needs that we've identified or we need to solve in the Victorian context. So what I've done here is in 2018, I engaged the OECD to perform an independent review of the Victorian legislation as implemented against its 9 better practice principles for independent fiscal institutions. This guidance represents the collective experience of the OECD through reviews of offices similar to mine around the world. And it provides a good roadmap for evolving IFI from their current state to that better practice. And so you can see on the slide, the spider diagram summarises each of the 9 OECD principles, and through a series of questioning and analysis, it comes up with its assessment of the Victorian PBO's enabling legislation against them. You'll notice it's a very sort of narrow band, and it, in summary, it described the PBO as having a very narrow scope. You'll also notice that there's 3 principles out of our 9 where our legislation fully meets better practice. The local ownership, the OECD found that the role and structure of the Victorian PBO reflects the local needs of members of Parliament for independent policy costings and advisory services. For independence and non-partisanship, it found that the enabling legislation provides for independent appointments and non-partisan analysis. And for communication, because we're able to publish on our own website and we don't have any restrictions, we have particularly on developing a well-functioning relationship with the media, we scored 4 points on that. I'd now like to explore some of the gaps in that diagram as well, which represents opportunities to evolve the PBO for greater public value. Now, for relationship with the legislature, the OECD noted the opportunity for the PBO to provide greater support to the work of parliamentary committees, including Victoria's PAYAC. In its 2021 inquiry into the PBO, PAYAC also made this recommendation, which the government has supported in principle. For transparency and mandate, the OECD found that the Victorian PBO would benefit from being able to publicly release its self-initiated research. Now, this is quite an important one and a bit of a theme through my presentation. Of over 40 IFI around the world, the Victorian PBO exists as the only one without a legislative mandate to prepare reports of its own volition. Being able to do this would enable us to raise public awareness and debate around fiscal, financial and economic matters, and clearly help us support our legislative objectives and achievement of those. Now, the OECD also found that the PBO has that narrow mandate, but that it's not linked to the state budget process. This disconnect, combined with the poor information supply performance of the public sector, has created some very significant challenges for us, where we are required to prepare policy costings against the latest budget or budget update, yet we receive a hard copy of the budget papers at the same time as the opposition leader and after the media. In its 2021 inquiry into the PBO, PAYAC made a recommendation that the Parliament consider amending the PBO Act to include a mandate for the Parliamentary Budget Officer to conduct an assessment of the budget. However, the government did not support this, instead suggesting that the budget is already scrutinised by the Victorian Auditor General. Now, this is unique in Australia. However, I feel that this is misleading, and the best way to describe this is to quote the signed statement of the Victorian Auditor General in the last publicly released budget. It says, "I have reviewed the estimated financial statements included in Chapter 1 of Budget Paper 5, Statement of Finances. My review does not include any of the remaining chapters of Budget Paper 5, nor does it include Budget Papers 1 through 4. So clearly, based on a limited review, which has a specific audit meaning of one portion of one of 5 budget papers, there's clearly scope for greater independent scrutiny and budget oversight to improve that public awareness and debate. To demonstrate this point, in a publicly released advice that I prepared on behalf of multiple MPs in 2021 titled Fiscal Objectives, Targets and Risks, I assessed the suite of budget papers against both OECD and IMF best practices, finding a low level of maturity and many options to improve the budget paper's role in informing the Victorian community. So clearly there's a local need for greater independent budget oversight beyond the limited review of the estimated financial statements of the Auditor General. So what type of functions could we look to go in terms of our scope and mandate within the PBO? How might we evolve from that very narrow mandate? So looking to the functions of other independent fiscal institutions, there's clearly no one size fits all. They're all dealing around the world with different local needs. But they all centre around those 9 broad functions that you can see on the slide pack there. Through its mandate to prepare policy costings and advice, you can see that the PBO in Victoria has mandate for 3 of these functions, the top 3. Through its response to PAYAC's inquiry into the PBO, government has given in principle support to the idea or the concept of supporting parliamentary committees. So that's the next logical step in our evolution that we'll pursue. But in relation to long-term fiscal sustainability analysis, in addition to the issue around the lack of analysis, The Victorian budget also prepares the current budget and 3 years of forward estimates. However, the IMF recommends longer-term projections. It requires that jurisdictions produce projections over 10 years, which can be used to identify whether public debt is on a sustainable or increasing growth path. The current fiscal environment presents strong reasons for the Victorian budget to present longer-run projections. So currently in the Victorian budget forecasts, net debt is expected to rise to nearly 25% of GSP by June 24, then keep rising to nearly 20% by 30th of June 25. We need longer run projections to show when and what level the government expects net debt to peak or stabilise in support of its fiscal target as the economy reacts to and recovers from COVID. Clearly, as you can see, many orders of magnitude larger the impact from COVID compared to the GFC. But the response of those European Union member states seen as an issue needing to be resolved. The Victorian PBO itself prepares policy costings, pre-election reports and policy election reports as well for not only the budget year, but we do it out for 10 years in addition as well, in line with those IMF requirements. Which demonstrates that it's both possible and our clients find it very, very valuable as well. So in conclusion, the establishment of the PBO represents an innovative addition to the parliamentary landscape in Victoria, and I'm very happy for the opportunity to be the inaugural parliamentary budget officer. However, it's predominantly designed to solve a very narrow local need of confidential policy costings and advice to MPs. Over its first parliamentary cycle, the Victorian PBO has established and embedded itself as a highly professional, relied on independent services to members of parliament. But we are ready to do more, particularly in relation to long-term fiscal sustainability analysis, briefings on the economy and public finances, monitoring compliance with fiscal rules, and supporting parliamentary committees. We also have very clear pathways informed by better practice for independent fiscal institutions, particularly the OECD, in relation to self-initiated reporting, which provides a greater focus on the Victorian community, and establishing links into the budget process to enhance the authority and independence of our work. These would better support our objectives of increasing public awareness and debate. So the slide that I've got up there is a direct quote from the OECD. It gives me comfort because it says, although with limited government support to recent PAYAC recommendations to evolve our mandate, our position is not unusual in the life cycle of an IFI. This quote really sums up the position nicely. I welcome the opportunity to continue to demonstrate value within our current mandate and for our client base of members of parliament and parliamentary leaders until such a time when the government of the day sees the opportunity for the Victorian PBO to be an important and independent partner in promoting credible fiscal policies. Thank you very much for your interest.
Thanks so much, Anthony. A lot for everyone to digest there, but it's always good to look at where Victoria sits, in particular in the global picture. I'll ask if any participants have any questions for Anthony. There's a question in the chat, Anthony, from Colleen. What powers do you have to compel public sector organisations to address your queries in a timely fashion in full? And I guess a follow-up to that, what strategies can you employ to increase the powers you clearly need so as to inform the taxpayers of Victoria about how their dollars are to be spent? So twofold questions there. Strategies first.
Look, thank you for that question, Colleen, and I think it's a very, very good one. I describe the powers in the legislation that I currently work with in my authorising environment as being information requesting powers, not information gathering powers. the main trigger for me to engage the OECD to perform a legislative review was there are a significant number of holes or risks, in terms of getting the information supply that we need to prepare our independent responses. And so that's really was the sort of the trigger for that. Over the last 4 years, all of those risks and concerns have been realised. So a public sector body can respond back to me with not practicable in the national defence interest to not hold it, and a range of other areas as well. But really, what I've got in essence is breaching of my act on an almost daily basis. The requirements or the legislation that the public sector bodies respond to me in 3 days, where we don't have standing arrangements, or longer if we have standing arrangements in place. So one of the challenges in that, within my legislation, I've got different ways of gathering information. So standing arrangements such as an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, can be established. And I've put a lot of energy and effort into trying to get those in place, with the offer of extended times where our clients don't need a very quick response, where it's a particularly challenging or burdensome request, and the opportunity to share our models and provide as much transparency as we can around the work that we do. However, the governance arrangements in Victoria are very collegiate around public sector. And so individual public sector bodies, which are a key basis of my act, have been, if you like, sort of sidestepped to negotiate on behalf of the Victorian Secretaries Board. Look, unfortunately, I think the Victorian Secretaries Board's also seen all of the gaps. And my perspective is that they've used the negotiations around setting up standing arrangements to give themselves more time to try and resolve some of those gaps in the legislation, rather than the spirit of what Memorandum of Understanding is, a good faith written agreement or understanding of what how the relationship's going to work. So I think it's a real challenge of PBOs and IFI in their early stage. If I reflect on the Australian PBO, the key difference that I saw or understand occurred between our establishment and its establishment was that those charged with governance is probably the best way to describe it, actually said, we want to make this work and you will provide this information to the public sector. We didn't get that in the Victorian PBO's case, and so I think that's almost implicit permission to not respond in a timely way. The main answer I get back is we're here to serve the government of the day, which creates a very circular argument to me, because the government of the day has actually established the legislation. So by responding to our requests, they're actually serving the government of the day, who is looking for better public parliamentary debate, better public debate around fiscal matters.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. Also, I'll just mention to participants as well, the Victorian PBO's website is a wealth of information, and there's some, I know the Memorandum of Understanding, there's the government statement of intent is available online there, so people may be interested to have a further look on there to sort of delve in a little bit deeper. I think there may be any other questions from any participants. I wondered, Anthony, if you could share a little bit more about how you see the PBO's role in supporting parliamentary committees, sort of what that might look like in practice.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jessica. And I think it's good to look at it in a couple of different ways. So I think first, globally, over a third of independent fiscal institutions in OECD countries actually directly support the legislature in budget analysis. So the key kind of tasks that they perform are, comprehensive analysis of government budget proposals. So that, CBO example I gave you in the US is a good one of that. But other countries such as Canada, Korea, Mexico, the Netherlands also do that type of work for parliamentary committees. Supporting committee inquiries is another area that they help with. And the Australian PBO, Canada, Italy, and the USA also do that as well. So, I think that's a very useful service of a parliamentary budget office. And then finally, they might do confidential budget analysis for parliamentary groups as well that might be looking at different areas within their remit of public finances, economic, fiscal, and financial matters. In Victoria, we do, looking at it from the Victorian point of view, we do policy costings and advice for members of parliament and in election times, parliamentary leaders. When people think of PBO and costing services, they immediately think of the result, which is the financial number that I estimate or determine at the end. But the majority of work that we do is upfront around not developing policy. We're not allowed to, and nor would I want to. But we do need to provide policy options to members of parliament to assist them to determine their policy proposals. And we do that by assessing different jurisdictions, looking at design, implementation factors, and a whole range of things to provide guidance to a member of parliament who might have previously been a farmer or a retail banker, or some of the people did, how to actually frame a policy in such a way, or how to specify a policy in such a way that it can then be costed. And I guarantee you, not one person I've spoken to has thought about whether they want to index the funds that they want to apply, and a whole range of factors that we need to consider when we do that. Applying that to the parliamentary committee context is, I see there's a lot of potential and value for us to do that as well, particularly in terms of that supporting the committee inquiries. The ability to work confidentially with PAYAC and other parliamentary committees in the Victorian context, I think would help to increase the sophistication and the value of the findings and recommendations that each of those parliamentary committees make. And I also think there's a critical mass and an economy of scales issue. We've got best way to describe it is centres of excellence of really good people like Jessica supporting each of the parliamentary committees. But we've got the potential for critical mass and economies of scale. We've got repeatable models. We hold data in our working papers and in our systems and repositories that's available, that may mean we don't even need to go out for an information request, or we don't need to do research because we already hold the key to that. My team's filled with costing analysts, policy analysts, and also economists, and I'm sure you'd all love access to them to help you with your report writing as well. So they're kind of sort of the key areas that I think that supporting parliamentary committee could evolve into.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Anthony. And I am aware we do have another question from Louise, but we are also at time, so I might take the liberty to ask Anthony that question and return to you with an answer on that regarding New South Wales PBO. But a big thank you to Anthony for making the time at what is a peak period of work for him and his office. Really appreciate your time and insights. And I will hand over to Carolyn.
Thank you, Jessica.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for today, and thank you for attending today's session. 3 sessions and 6 great presentations. Just briefly, I'll just give you a quick overview of what you heard today. We heard firstly from Dr. Sarah Moles, who talked about connecting parliaments. And she told us, or gave us demonstration of different ways in which people can engage with Parliament or their elected representatives. She provided some examples and experiences around the world using a range of strategies and innovations. She also introduced the iPen toolkit, which I'm sure during your lunch break you all had a look at. The toolkit is to assist with public engagement and to improve the quality and diversity of that public engagement. That was followed by a PhD student, Rachel Tan, who was looking at social media platforms and their duty of care with regard to, hate speech. I must say that she did mention a couple of trendy social media platforms that have a huge impact on society. But for those who have studied law or have studied legal studies, it was refreshing to hear about Donoghue and Stevenson once again. Rachel gave us a couple of examples, which included New Zealand, UK and Australia, and that covered a range of acts, codes and bills. So I'll go back and read my legal studies handbook now and refresh myself with Donoghue and Stevenson. I hope you all do the same. Session 4, which was after lunch, was on transparency, and we had Associate Professors Julie Debiak and Laura Grenfell. They talked about their book that they have edited, Lawmaking and Human Rights, and they talked largely about the conclusion and the introduction. And one of the key themes was human rights instruments and the need for human rights scrutiny and the benefits of such scrutiny and statements of compatibility. And the fact, again, they said that public engagement is very important. That was followed by Raqib Bayan, Web Robots to Parliament. That was a bit close to my heart, that one. Software visits to websites to get downloads and information and how that information is being used. So using open data principles, we heard a couple of examples from governments across Australia. But the question is, what is the data people are seeking and what is that data being used for? And another thing close to my heart was the use of structured information or structured data. Being a librarian, that's important. The use of open data allows researchers to scan decades of Hansard in just a short time. So a few things we can learn there, including some other examples about Twitter bots, including how many times please, thank you, and sorry can be used through Hansard. After that, we had Alicia Westgate and the withdrawal of strangers, which was really interesting. We're all strangers. We don't know each other and we don't trust each other. And she opened her presentation with those words and a couple of other Shakespearean comments and Robert Gordon Menzies. And the fact that during the war, a lot of discussions or matters were discussed in private and that those strangers had to be withdrawn from the House. And we heard that 3 times strangers have been withdrawn from the House of Representatives during wartime. Finally, we had Mr. Anthony Close, a colleague, the inaugural PBO we call Victorian Parliamentary Budget Officer, the PBO here. We heard about Anthony's role in the establishment of the 2018 PBO. We're one of only 5 in the world and only the 3rd jurisdiction that do election policy costings. Anthony gave us an update on his powers or the powers of the PBO, what they provide to the members and how that can help the public make informed decisions. He also spoke of a couple of hundred requests for information and the frustrations about the response to getting that information when he makes a request. We heard also that he asked the OECD for an independent review of the Act and also he talked about opportunities to improve services and transparency. On that note, I want to thank you all for attending today. Please make sure you attend the AGM, which is coming up immediately soon after I switch off. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you again shortly. See you later.